Welcome, insomniacs and thrill seekers, to your new nightmare. Do you ever feel a prickle on the back of your neck? A sense that something unseen watches you from the shadows? Do you hear whispers in the dead of night? Whispers that promise chilling secrets? We all have those moments, those times when the veil between reality and the terrifying unknown seems paper thin. Here, on this channel, we delve into those moments, those unsettling stories that lurk just beneath the surface. We'll explore the darkness that lives in abandoned asylums, the malevolent entities that haunt ancient forests, and the bone-chilling encounters that plague everyday lives. So, gather close, light a candle if you dare, because tonight, we're going to make you afraid of everything.
He resided in a humble hut perched on a desolate hillside, shunned by all who knew of him. His name, age, and origins remained mysteries to the locals, obscured by time or deliberate silence. Any kin he might have had in the vicinity had either departed long ago or concealed their connection to him, unwilling to be associated with the outcast. Encountered on roads or in fields, people averted their gazes, some offering prayers while others whispered protective charms inherited from generations past. Though children sometimes dared to mock him, their bravado faded when adults intervened, dispersing them with stern reprimands. It was common knowledge that to behold the nameless man or linger in his presence, no matter how fleetingly, was to court misfortune. The Sin Eater, once dismissed as merely a cautionary tale told by weary parents to discipline unruly children, was a living embodiment of fear. He served but one purpose, summoned by an unspoken signal that drew him to homes in the district where wakes were underway. The Sin Eater's presence was uncanny, as if guided by an instinct known only to him. His duty was simple: to consume a modest meal from a wooden bowl placed upon the chest of the deceased, thereby shouldering the burdens of their sins, be they of man, woman, or child. It was believed that by doing so, he facilitated the departed's swift journey from purgatory to paradise. With his task completed, the Sin Eater would retreat to his humble abode, marking the end of the ritual. The bowl, meticulously crafted for this solemn occasion, was invariably consigned to flames once the ritual concluded. "He is the final vestige of a bygone era," lamented the parish priest, his expression tinged with sorrow. Despite the clash with his own theological convictions, he harbored a wistful regard for the traditions of old. Yet, beyond nostalgia, he harbored a profound desire to alleviate the plight of the outcast dwelling upon the hillside, the most marginalized among his flock. Though limited in his capacity to effect change, he resolved to offer what assistance he could. It had become a routine for the parish priest to leave sustenance for the Sin Eater at the entrance to the churchyard on the first day of each month. Reverend Monckton stood vigilantly, a sense of obligation compelling him to ensure that the provisions were not pilfered by any passing wanderer. A drizzle persisted, a lingering trace of the storms that had swept across the Welsh hills to the west. "I believe you're overly accommodating their superstitions," grumbled the squire, engaged in conversation with his longtime friend, disdaining any adherence to antiquated customs. Sir John Prescott embodied progressivism, advocating for science, education, and advancement. He had spearheaded the introduction of the railway and telegraph to his remote corner of Herefordshire. Thus, it came as no surprise that Sir John regarded sin-eating, along with practices such as witchcraft and fortune-telling, as relics of a bygone era. In the year of our Lord 1889, an era of enlightenment, with the British Empire committed to spreading civilization across the globe, any respectable Victorian gentleman could not turn a blind eye to the perceived backwardness of the English rural population. Thanks to Sir John's progressive approach, his tenants enjoyed access to clean water and their children received proper education. The squire had even attempted to initiate a vaccination campaign for them, relenting only after the priest cautioned him about potential backlash. Murmurs of discontent had already surfaced when a steam thresher was introduced during harvest season. Grudgingly, Sir John had suspended the vaccination program. "You're somewhat harsh on these people, my dear friend," remarked the priest, broaching the familiar subject. "They cling to familiar rituals in a swiftly changing, uncertain world. We all seek solace, particularly when we feel powerless over our destinies. And let's not forget, tradition upholds our privileged positions within our small community, just as it confines that poor soul to his." Monckton gestured towards the hills, and Sir John peered into the misty rain. Indeed, the Sin-Eater was approaching. The man shuffled like a living scarecrow, a gaunt figure draped in tattered garments, hobbling along the muddy country lane that wound past the church. He kept his gaze lowered, the brim of a slouched hat obscuring most of his face, which was further concealed by a tangled mass of hair and beard. "Disgraceful," scoffed Sir John. "Such a wretched, disturbed simpleton ought to be in a hospital or asylum, not wandering untamed in the hills." The landowner, overcome with revulsion, turned away and retreated into the church. Meanwhile, the priest remained on the porch, shielded from the rain, observing the nameless man consume his meal just beyond the consecrated grounds. Monckton understood well that the Sin-Eater, regarded as lower than a leper, could never encroach upon sacred territory. Indeed, the outcast was barred from entering any place inhabited by respectable folk, save for the singular occasion when he fulfilled his role in the rural community. After finishing his modest repast, the pariah straightened up, his gaze fixed upon the church porch where the priest stood vigil. Despite the ragged slouch hat obscuring his features, Monckton discerned a faint glimmer emanating from the man's deeply set eyes. Does he truly believe it? Monckton pondered silently. Does he genuinely sense the weight of the departed sins seeping into his body, his soul, as he partakes of that meager fare? It was heretical even to entertain such thoughts, yet Monckton couldn't help but wonder. Surely, the Sin-Eater's faith must be as unwavering as his own. But what torment it must be for the poor soul. The priest felt an urge to approach the gate, to engage the Sin-Eater in conversation, to offer him spiritual comfort. Yet he restrained himself. He knew all too well the consequences of such actions. His parishioners would gossip, attendance at his services would dwindle, and he risked losing the respect of the community. Monckton had witnessed the downfall of imprudent clergy before. The nameless man who bore the sins of others was deemed inherently evil. How could he be otherwise, burdened as he was with the collective wrongdoing of the departed? Engaging with him would be akin to tainting oneself with the sins he carried. Thus, the priest settled for a tentative wave of acknowledgement. Initially met with no response, it was eventually acknowledged by the Sin-Eater with a brief nod before he retreated on his solitary path. As he disappeared from view, the priest sighed and made his way back into the church to rejoin his friend. "Skittered back to his lair, did he?" inquired Sir John, rising with stiffness from the bench. "Retreating like an animal. Disgraceful. No matter how destitute he may appear, he remains a human being, a child of God, possessing an immortal soul, just like you and I," admonished the priest gently. For a moment, the squire appeared as though he might take offense at the comparison to a ragged simpleton at the bottom rung of society. However, Sir John's fondness for his friend always prevailed. He grinned and gave the priest a light punch on the shoulder. "Indeed, you're correct, Philip," he conceded with a hint of embarrassment. "Sometimes I forget my Christian duty. You do what you can for that unfortunate fellow, just as I endeavor to assist the villagers. It's no simple task to uplift people entrenched in medieval superstition, though. Let's shift our focus, John," suggested the priest, guiding his friend into the vestry where they could converse undisturbed. Monckton retrieved a bottle of whiskey and poured them each a generous measure, citing it as a means to ward off the chill, as was his custom. A brief silence ensued as they savored the aroma of the single malt. "Now, that's what the Scots would call a good swally," remarked Sir John appreciatively. "Indeed," agreed the priest, replenishing their glasses. "Sometimes, a nice hot cup of tea simply won't suffice to warm the soul." Sir John, buoyed by the whiskey, adopted a more serious demeanor. "True, Philip, but let's not forget the harm strong drink can do," he cautioned. Monckton sighed inwardly, realizing that another delicate topic had emerged. "I gather Victor isn't faring well in his medical pursuits?" inquired Sir John, his concern evident. The squire's nephew, taken in after his parents perished in a shipwreck returning from India, had long been a source of worry for Sir John. As an elderly bachelor set in his ways, he had grappled with the challenge of raising his late brother's son with the right blend of compassion and discipline. Sir John had endeavored to instill honesty and industriousness in Victor, while Monckton had sought to nurture his spiritual development. Yet both had fallen short. Prior to Victor's departure for London, there had been troubling incidents involving servant girls, necessitating significant financial settlements to resolve. The priest recalled the unsettling gaze of Victor's eyes, crafty, malevolent, almost inhuman, reminiscent of a reptile endowed with human intellect. He couldn't help but shiver. "You're being quite tactful, Philip," acknowledged the squire, staring into his whiskey. "But it appears the lad has descended deeper into moral decay. His academic pursuits are neglected. I received word from the teaching hospital warning of his impending expulsion due to chronic absenteeism. Instead, he writes to request money, only to squander it in the East End on heaven knows what. Based on his handwriting, it's evident he's either a drunkard or worse. We're both seasoned individuals," remarked Monckton, attempting to tread delicately. "We understand that young people often need to blow off steam in one way or another. After all, we did each in our own manner. And truth be told, there are worse things to do in London than simply getting intoxicated." Even as the words left his lips, the priest realized his misstep. The squire's expression darkened, likely pondering the various pitfalls awaiting impressionable youths in the city. Monckton swiftly redirected the conversation. "Perhaps Victor isn't suited for a career in surgery?" Sir John chuckled. "Unfortunate choice of words there, but I fear you may be correct. Just last week, I penned a letter instructing him to return home and face me to discuss his aspirations. He's due to arrive tomorrow on the noon train. Would you be so kind as to visit in the afternoon? A bit of moral support would be greatly appreciated." The priest nodded, masking his reluctance with a forced smile. He had little desire to re-engage with Victor, but he would fulfill his duty as a friend nonetheless. "Try to keep your composure with the lad, John. It's challenging for a boy to navigate the path to manhood in today's world. The youth face tremendous pressures, unlike anything we encountered in more tranquil times. The squire and the priest exchanged a few more words before parting amicably. As Reverend Monckton secured the church, he paused by the gate of the churchyard to inspect the remnants of the Sin-Eater's meal. A few crumbs of bread and bits of fruit peel remained in the earthenware bowl, while the old, chipped jug that once held rough cider sat empty. After a brief moment of contemplation, the priest decided to shatter the bowl and the jug against the gatepost, just in case anyone happened to be observing. The following afternoon, the priest made his way from his parsonage to the manor house, hoping to find uncle and nephew reconciled, or at least engaged in conversation. His path led him through the village, where he greeted members of his congregation as they went about their daily activities. Initially, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but as he proceeded, Reverend Monckton noticed a gathering movement along the main street, all heading in the same direction as him. What's more, they were dressed in their Sunday finest attire, the women adorned in elegant bonnets and dresses, the men clad in somber black suits. One talkative laborer, Jethro, noticed the priest's perplexed expression and joined him. "You haven't heard the news, Reverend?" "What news, Jethro?" inquired Monckton. "Squire's nephew has passed away," replied Jethro with a hint of satisfaction, relishing in being the bearer of grim tidings. "Aye," added a woman, falling into step with them. "The lad was discovered deceased by the ticket inspector upon the train's arrival at Hereford. Found laid out on the carriage floor, he was... The police brought the body to the hall just before midday." Monckton's heart sank at the news. His thoughts turned to his friend, facing the loss of his only blood relative and sole heir. "Forgive me, I must hasten," he excused himself, picking up his pace. The priest reached the manor ahead of most villagers, finding a line of men and women outside the grange, awaiting their turn to pay respects as tradition dictated. Sir John, to his credit, stood on the steps of the elegant portico, engaging with each tenant individually. Monckton couldn't help but feel a surge of empathy for his longtime friend, understanding the squire's likely desire to withdraw from the world at such a trying time. As the locals made way for the priest, offering subdued greetings and tipping their hats, Monckton remained composed, mindful of the villagers' observant eyes. He exchanged nods with Sir John and shook his hand before the squire faltered, his voice catching. "Please go inside. He is in dash." Sir John paused, gathering himself before continuing. "His body is laid out in the drawing room." With a solemn nod, Monckton entered the manor, leaving his friend to receive further condolences from the tenants. A servant silently guided him to the library, where the drawn curtains subdued the afternoon sunlight. Oil lamps and candles cast a somber glow over the youthful figure laid out before him. Leaning closer, the priest studied the pale, smooth-shaven face of the departed. "Even in death, there is no rest," he mused. The departed always seemed to harbor a restless spirit, unable to find peace. One can only pray that he has now found solace in the embrace of our Savior. With a brief prayer and the sign of the cross over the deceased, Monckton left the library and stepped into the manor hallway. As he did, he caught the sound of commotion outside. Voices raised in surprise, alarm, perhaps even fear. Curiosity piqued. He hastened to the doorway and peered out. The crowd gathered to pay their respects to the squire had swelled. Nearly 100 men and women now congregated outside the grange. They parted hurriedly, much like they had for the priest moments earlier. Yet this time it wasn't out of reverence. No, they moved aside with haste, some even colliding or stumbling, every individual wary of drawing too close to the Sin Eater. The outcast made his way up the drive toward the grand house, moving slowly and laboriously, his limp evident. Moncton observed his bare, rag-wrapped feet and filthy, tattered attire. Once again, the broad brim of his hat concealed his features. However, Sir John remained unmoved, refusing to yield to the Sin Eater. The nameless man ascended the 3 deep stone steps onto the portico, his limp pronounced as he halted before the squire. Moncton rushed to his friend's side, grasping Sir John's arm with urgency. Sensing the tension coursing through the squire, Moncton leaned in and whispered urgently, "Please, John, allow the man inside. I implore you. He poses no threat." Sir John's complexion paled with shock as he glanced around anxiously. "Philip, how can I permit that creature near the poor lad?" The priest tightened his grip on Sir John's arm. "You must, John. The community will never forgive you if you do not. Do this for me, John, if not for yourself." Silence enveloped them as the 2 men locked eyes, neither willing to yield. Moncton could hear murmurs among the tenants gathered nearby. Meanwhile, the Sin Eater remained motionless, resembling the scarecrow he was often likened to. The priest wondered if the man could even speak, having had no one to converse with for decades. "Very well," acquiesced Sir John, and the priest released his hold on his arm. The squire swiftly made his way indoors, instructing a servant to prepare a plate of cold beef and deliver it to the priest. With the path cleared, the Sin Eater hobbled inside, instinctively heading for the library without need for direction. Moncton followed, finding the man standing silently beside the deceased, his expression unchanged. "The meal will be brought shortly," the priest announced, though there was no indication the Sin Eater had heard him. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as Moncton pondered the delay in the kitchen. His own heartbeat reverberated loudly in his ears, and he couldn't shake off the unpleasant odor emanating from the unwashed Sin Eater. A scent of sweat and neglect accumulated over years, if not decades. Finally, the cook arrived with a plate piled high with cold meat, which she handed to the priest before hastily retreating without a glance at the nameless man. Moncton, grateful for her efficiency, approached the table where the body lay and delicately placed the plate upon the young man's chest before stepping back. The Sin Eater remained motionless. Moncton wondered if he had overlooked some necessary invitation to commence the meal, but none of the accounts he had heard mentioned a specific ritual or wording to initiate it. "I can hardly say grace," he thought, feeling at a loss. More time elapsed, and the priest contemplated whether he should depart. Perhaps his presence as a clergyman was hindering the ritual? However, leaving the Sin Eater alone with his friend's nephew felt like a betrayal. Unsure, he remained, staring down at the unappealing plate of flesh, the thudding of his own heartbeat resonating loudly in his ears. Then, amidst the silence, he heard something, a woman's scream. Initially assuming it to be from outside, perhaps one of the village women succumbing to hysteria, the sudden cessation of the shrieking left him disconcerted. Scanning the room, Moncton found nothing amiss until his gaze returned to the Sin Eater. For the first time, the outcast's face bore a discernible expression, an expression of profound despair. His sunken eyes seemed to reflect the anguish of a damned soul, causing the priest to question his deeply held beliefs in a fleeting moment of doubt. What if it's true? Perhaps he does absorb the sins of the dead, Moncton pondered. If so, this man must be enduring hell on earth. Stepping back involuntarily, The priest half raised his hand as if to fend off an invisible threat. In response, the sin-eater offered a faint smile, his mouth barely visible beneath a mass of unkempt beard. With that, the nameless man bent over the corpse and began to consume the meat with fingers tainted by dirt. Turning away, Moncton tried to block out the sound of chewing and swallowing, feeling a profound sense of discomfort settle within him. No, it's all absurd, Moncton admonished himself internally, seeking to dismiss the unsettling feelings that had arisen within him. While one mustn't scorn the beliefs of the less privileged, one must remain steadfast in matters of faith. This is merely superstition. Before long, the ancient ritual concluded, and the sin-eater stood motionless for a moment, licking grease from his fingers. Then, without so much as a glance back at the priest, he departed. Once again, the villagers made way for him as he made his way down the driveway and out of the estate. With his departure, a palpable sense of relief washed over the crowd, their collective sighs echoing through the air. Though their conversation remained subdued out of respect for the deceased, an undercurrent of relief was unmistakable. The ritual had been observed, and both priest and squire had paid homage to the traditions of old. Following the sin-eater outside, Moncton raised his hands to gain attention and adopted his most solemn tone. "Dear friends," he addressed the gathered crowd from atop the steps, "we are truly grateful for your presence here today to offer condolences to Sir John. He deeply appreciates your kind thoughts, but requests your understanding as he seeks solace in private prayer and reflection for the remainder of this somber day." The locals departed, nodding in agreement with the sentiment expressed by the priest. Moncton considered that Sir John might find it more feasible to introduce innovations in the future. Perhaps he would even consider vaccination for the community next year, he mused. Returning indoors, he sought out his friend and discovered him in the drawing room, seated before a cold fireplace, surrounded by a pile of luggage. "His belongings?" Moncton inquired, gesturing toward the bags. Sir John nodded solemnly. "Do they know the cause of his death?" the priest asked. The squire looked up, his eyes glistening with tears. "The authorities found a bottle of poison during their search of the railway carriage. It had rolled under the seat. Obtaining it from the medical school was all too easy for him." "Suicide?" "But surely he wouldn't," Moncton started to say. Sir John rose abruptly, avoiding his friend's gaze. "Philip, would you mind looking through his belongings for me? I cannot bring myself to do it. He was my brother's son, and I pledged to protect him. Perhaps you'll uncover something that sheds light on this tragic event." His voice faltered, tears welling in his eyes. "If you cannot find an explanation, I will have no choice but to conclude that Victor took his own life rather than confront me. My anger, my lack of understanding. Please, find another explanation if you can." For a time, the priest sat alone, contemplating the modest collection of belongings. With a sense of duty, he opened the first traveling bag and began to sift through its contents. However, his search yielded no diary or letters, nothing to offer insight into the young man's final days. The second bag proved equally unhelpful. Left with only the medical bag, he knew it would contain nothing but surgical instruments and vials of drugs. But then there was something more. Moncton reached into a side pocket and retrieved some folded newspaper clippings. Spreading them out on a nearby table, he began to read. It didn't take long to discern the common thread. Even in the remote reaches of Western England, the community had been captivated by the most significant news story of the past year. The priest scanned the familiar headlines, Has Whitechapel killer claimed new victim? Shocking mutilation of murdered woman. Police taunted by Jack the Ripper. Setting aside the clippings, Monckton peered once more into the medical student's bag. With deliberate care, he extracted one of the instruments he had glanced at earlier. Moving to the window for better light, he scrutinized it closely. There, on the narrow steel blade, were unmistakable flecks of brown matter. This proves nothing, Monckton muttered to himself. Victor may have had a morbid imagination, nothing more. Young men often indulge in such macabre fascinations. Returning the scalpel to the bag and securing it, he retrieved the newspaper clippings and stuffed them into his coat pocket. We may never uncover the reason behind his actions, he declared to his reflection in the mirror above the fireplace. Then, with added resolve, he continued, "Some mysteries are beyond our grasp, John. Yet we can take solace in the mercy of God, regardless of our transgressions. That must be our comfort in times of turmoil." Taking a deep breath, Monckton readied himself to seek out the squire. However, a sudden recollection halted him in his tracks. The moment when the library had been pierced by a piercing scream, just before the sin-eater claimed his meal and burden. "It proves nothing," the priest repeated, attempting to dispel the troubling thoughts. "Absolutely nothing." He tried to push aside the image of the nameless man shouldering the sins of a monstrous being. For years, he had witnessed the sin-eater absorbing the petty wrongdoings of ordinary villagers, the mundane desires, jealousies, and angers of rural life. And he attempted to banish the memory of the sin-eater's visage, with eyes akin to those of a reptile, devoid of all humanity. No, this notion is absurd, unscientific, and against all religious doctrine. I refuse to entertain it, Monckton asserted vehemently. Yet, even as he spoke, his reflection in the mirror seemed unconvinced.